Never touch the sandbags in a trench when it's raining. I'm lying at the very bottom of this foxhole right now, unable to move a muscle. If the sky doesn't lighten up soon, I'm going to be buried alive by these things. Rainwater trickles down the rim of my helmet, dripping into my neck, making me shiver uncontrollably. It's pitch black all around, like being inside an ink bottle. My right cheek is pressed flat against the sandbags on the parapet of the position. Those sandbags were stacked up just this afternoon to help block bullets. They feel bizarre. Even in the daytime, they felt cold to the touch. Now at night, with most of my body weight leaning on them, I realize they're eerily soft. There's no rough, grid-like fabric texture of canvas. Instead, they feel like rubber that's been soaking in water for a long time, with a slimy, thick outer layer. Just then, a sharp whistle comes from the enemy position in the distance. A moment later, a pale white flare wobbles up into the sky. The entire muddy trench is suddenly bathed in a ghastly white light, even the puddles on the ground reflecting it. Taking advantage of those few seconds of light, I turn my head to the right. What I see makes every hair on my body stand on end. What my face had been pressed against wasn't canvas at all. It was covered in the texture of human skin, dotted with countless tiny bumps. It had the shape of a person. Muddy water was smeared all over this thing. It was tightly packed together with several identical gray-green bodies, stacked layer upon layer, roughly piled into the shape of sandbags. What made my scalp crawl the most was that, under that pale light, a crack suddenly split open in the mud-caked skin of the big lump I was leaning against. The crack widened, pulling apart on both sides. Inside, a huge, glistening eyeball stained with dirty water was revealed. That eyeball stiffly rolled most of the way around in its socket, locking directly onto my eyes. It was looking at me. Then the flesh above the crack slowly lowered, and then lifted again. It was winking at me. The flare in the sky began to fall, the light growing dimmer. The sandbag piles around me, which had been dead still, suddenly all came to life the moment darkness returned. They started shifting left and right in the muddy water. Hundreds of pounds of dead flesh pressed against each other, making a dull, squelching sound. I could hear bones breaking inside these things, a crisp, clicking noise, like joints folding desperately into dead angles with no direction. The weight above began to press down, shoving me deeper into the muck at the bottom of the pit. My rifle was stuck in between, the bolt filled with mud, impossible to pull. I could barely breathe. The gray-green thick flesh above, reeking of stagnant water, sealed off the sky over my head. How did things get to this point? It all started around 3:30 this afternoon. The rain had been pouring non-stop for 3 days and 3 nights, with no sign of letting up. Me and a few new guys from the squad put on our soaked raincoats and trudged through the passageway, stepping in and out of deep puddles. The mud was already up to our knees. Every step, our boots were sucked tight by the thick mud underneath, and we had to use all our strength to pull them out. The squad leader was at the front, his helmet caked with yellow mud. He turned around, shouting at the top of his lungs for us to hurry up and relieve the guard at foxhole number 2, the outermost position. That foxhole was the most isolated spot on the entire line, jutting out a long way with no one watching either side. Our rifles were covered in sticky mud, even the slings too slippery to grip. Halfway there, we found that the parapet in front of foxhole number 2 had collapsed in a big chunk. The squad leader spat on the ground and pointed to an abandoned corner nearby, telling us to go grab the new sandbags there to reinforce it. That pile of sandbags was sitting in a muddy pit overgrown with weeds, covered with a tattered plastic sheet. Me and another new guy crouched down and reached for the top sandbag. The moment my fingers touched that thing, I knew something was off. A normal canvas sandbag filled with dry sand is hard and stiff, and the sand shifts with the shape of your hand. This new sandbag was as heavy as a solid block of iron. The 3 of us gritted our teeth and strained together, our heavy breathing loud in the rain. We shoved our hands underneath to lift it, and my fingers sank in deep. There were no coarse, stitching threads on the surface. It felt ice-cold, slippery, covered in a thick, dead layer of skin. At that moment, I was so exhausted that my head was spinning, and my vision was blurry. I thought the stuff had just been soaking in the water for too many days, and the mud inside had frozen solid. Gritting our teeth, the few of us hauled those dozen or so bags of unbearably heavy, dead flesh, one by one, over to the spot and stacked them neatly at the very front of the number 2 foxhole. The sky gradually turned pitch black. The heavy rain was still pounding wildly against our steel helmets, making a tat-tat-tat noise. After dark, we couldn't see anything around us, except for the occasional flash of lightning on the distant horizon. I crouched side by side with that comrade called New Recruit in the narrow, muddy trench, to dodge any stray bullets that might fly our way. I pressed my back and shoulders as hard as I could against the stack of sandbags we had piled up during the day. Time crawled by incredibly slowly. I huddled there, my ears filled with the sound of my comrade beside me quietly blowing his nose. Slowly, I noticed a strange movement coming from the breastwork I was leaning against. That pile of sandbags wasn't getting harder. Instead, it was starting to soften. Every time I took a deep breath out of nervousness, the big lump of flesh behind me would also shrink back a little, and when I inhaled, it would push back against me ever so slightly. It felt like there was a living person's belly pressed right against my back. I reached back with my palm and felt a hollow indentation. The shape of that hollow was exactly like a person's ribs. Just then, bubbles started rising from the muddy water beneath our feet. Gurgle, gurgle. The sound was loud. These bubbles were being squeezed out from inside the sandbags buried at the very bottom, the ones we were standing on. It sounded like something was buried under the mud, gulping down the filthy water in big mouthfuls. My comrade beside me heard it too. He shifted nervously, raised his rifle, and clamped his finger tightly around the trigger guard. The rain outside was falling even harder. Suddenly, from the mud at the outermost edge of the trench, came a heavy dragging sound. Something heavy was sliding toward us through the muddy water. That heavy dragging sound grew closer, standing out clearly against the crackling rain. My comrade couldn't take it anymore. His legs were shaking violently, making a splashing racket in the muddy water. He suddenly let out a loud roar, jammed his rifle firmly against his shoulder, and pulled the trigger at the pitch-black mud ahead. The muzzle flash lit up the dark trench in an instant. Bang, 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 bang. Bullet after bullet flew out. By the red flash of the muzzle, I could see what was in front of us. In the muddy pit less than 5 meters away, there was a big pile of sandbags stacked high. Those sandbags weren't staying put at all. They had fused together, like a giant, 100-pound fat worm, squirming and sliding forward through the mud. My comrade was still firing wildly, every bullet hitting that moving pile of sandbags without missing. But the sound of those bullets hitting was bizarre. There was none of the crisp thwack, thwack of bullets striking dirt or bulletproof canvas. All I heard was a dull, muffled thud, 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 like someone was pounding a heavy wooden mallet into waterlogged dead pork, over and over. As the muzzle flashed on and off, I clearly saw the bullets punch into the gray-green surface of those sandbags, only leaving small craters. No sand flew out of those holes. Instead, the thick layer of dead flesh contracted inward, like a living mouth, clamping down on the bullets that went in and swallowing them. The spots that were hit didn't even leave a single penetration hole, just a few deep dents, and then the flesh inside started writhing wildly. That finally woke the thing up completely. The big pile of meat that had been lying on the ground suddenly shook violently, and its internal structure changed. Instead of scattering like normal sandbags when hit, the heavy chunks on top suddenly pulled together, and then the whole body rose straight up out of the muddy water. It extended two long, thick pillars. These pillars were covered in wrinkles. With no visible human knees or elbow joints to bend, they were physical limbs twisted together from several thick pieces of flesh, like human thighs. That limb, covered in grotesque meat, swung a huge arc through the air with a piercing whistle, then slammed sideways toward our foxhole. I was so scared I shrank back, my ass sinking deep into the mud at the bottom. That big meat pillar hit with a smack, striking the breastwork we had built in front. The sandbags we had stacked up during the day were caved in a big chunk by that slap. Before I could even stand up, that pillar scraped along the wall and slammed straight into my comrade's chest. I heard a very loud crack. It was the sound of his bones breaking in a massive area. His entire chest caved in by 2 inches in that instant, and a huge gush of dirty water shot from his mouth. The sheer force of several hundred pounds sent him flying backward. His body flipped half a turn in the air, crashed heavily into the earthen wall of the communication trench behind him, and then slid limply into the knee-deep mud. "Pull me up! Pull me up!" My comrade thrashed wildly in the mud. His left shoulder had completely collapsed, with bone fragments poking through his clothes, and his entire left arm was twisted unnaturally against his back. He clawed desperately at the earthen wall behind him with his right hand, his legs kicking frantically in the muddy water, trying to push himself up. But every time he exerted force, a wheezing "ha-kai" sound escaped his mouth, and he couldn't muster any strength. At that moment, the monster that had smashed the parapet started moving even more violently. It lunged forward in the mud, and more dead flesh crawled from the outer darkness into our foxhole. The sandbags on the parapet collapsed along with it. Those sandbags, which were supposed to shield us from bullets, began to spill out chunks of meat. Thick, fleshy hands with 5 fingers, but no nails sprouted from the seams of the sandbags. They groped wildly in the air, crushing clumps of dirt around them. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward my comrade. I fell into the muck, kicking my legs backward with all my might to drag myself closer. I grabbed his intact right sleeve with my right hand and pulled him backward with every ounce of strength I had. His body was as heavy as a dead ox, and we left 2 deep furrows in the mud. The earthen wall behind me was shaking too. The entire side of the foxhole was shedding large chunks of mud. I looked up and saw that, at some point, 3 of those grayish-green lumps had been buried in the soil above my head. They had now burst through the dry crust of mud. Those 3 lumps began to blink extremely slowly in the downpour. Their eyelids were covered in rings of slime, glistening under the rain. They started pulling themselves out of the dirt. The thick, black, rubber-like ligaments connecting their bodies were stretched taut, emitting a piercing, screeching squeak sound, like a big truck braking hard in the mud. My comrade's cries grew fainter. His lower body was already buried under the collapsing mud and flesh from behind. The sandbags that had surfaced from beneath the mud were piling up layer by layer on his stomach. I pulled his right hand with all my might, but his body was being swallowed bit by the mud and dead flesh below. The gaps between my fingers were filled with yellow mud scraped from his clothes. In the distant darkness, more dragging sounds arose. All those piles of sandbags, big and small, were moving toward our foxhole. They squeezed out more white bubbles in the muddy water. At that moment, the entire position felt like the stomach of a living creature, and we were the bugs that had fallen into it. All around us, thick, heavy dead flesh weighing hundreds of pounds was writhing, slowly squeezing us together. Just as I thought I was about to be buried alive, the immense force around me suddenly stopped. The massive chunks of flesh that had been closing in crashed heavily back into the mud, once again becoming a pile of lifeless sandbags, motionless. The cracking sounds of breaking bones around us also ceased, leaving only the patter of rain hitting the steel helmets. I lay in the muddy water, my hands gripping the earthen wall behind me. My clothes and pants were filled with cold, slimy mud. I gasped for breath, rainwater and mud pouring into my mouth. I turned my head to look at my comrade. He was slumped at the corner of the communication trench, his lower body buried in the foxhole's mud. He had stopped shouting, just leaning his head against the earthen wall, his right hand clutching his completely collapsed left shoulder, letting out weak groans. I shook my head and wiped the mud from around my eyes. At that moment, the radio handset hanging from my chest suddenly emitted a burst of harsh static. SHHH. SHHH. The battalion commander's voice came through the radio. He was shouting at the top of his lungs, his tone urgent. The commander was shouting inside, saying that after 3 days of continuous heavy rain, a severe mudslide had occurred on the high ground behind our defensive line. The remains of many fallen soldiers and issued supplies had mixed together, all washing down the slope into the trenches below. He was yelling over the radio for us not to panic, to hold our positions, and that the things shifting in the mud might just be camouflage netting, dead branches, or waterlogged sleeping bags that had swelled up from the collapse. Hearing those words over the radio, the heart that had been in my throat settled back down a little. I looked at the pile of sandbags in front of me, which had gone still again, and figured the commander might be right. In the heavy rain, you couldn't see anything in the dark, and with the mud washing through, heavy debris from the collapse could indeed crush a person badly. That thick meaty pillar I saw earlier might just have been a swollen tree trunk tangled up in camouflage netting. I crawled on all fours toward my buddy, trying to pull him out of the muck. To get a look at his wound, I reached into my tactical vest and pulled out that old-fashioned flashlight, pushing the switch with my thumb. A yellowish beam lit up the muddy water beneath our feet. That's when I noticed some strange changes in the surroundings. With the rain coming down so hard, the wastewater in the trench should have been piling up, stained yellow by the mud. But now, the water under our feet had turned sticky. It dripped off the edges of my boots, pulling into long, shiny strands like snot. Under the flashlight, those strands gave off a sickly gray-green glow. Even stranger, the mud we were standing on was unnaturally hot. I shoved my gloved hand into the muck to grab my buddy's leg. As soon as my hand went in, I felt that the sludge wasn't cold at all, it was warm, like sticking your hand into a pot of freshly cooked hot paste. The sandbags buried under the mud were making tiny, subtle movements. Through my glove, I could clearly feel the hard lumps beneath the mud gently contracting and then springing back. The contractions were tiny, just a few millimeters, as if they were holding back with great effort. The flashlight beam swept past my buddy's feet, and I saw that the gray-green sandbag, skin under his boot, was starting to ooze a fine layer of beads of moisture. Those beads weren't flowing down with the rain. Instead, they were pushing out against the rain, emerging densely from that skin-like thick hide. The static on the radio suddenly got louder, and the commander's voice started cutting in and out. Along the entire defensive line, there was no gunfire, only the sound of rain, a dead silence that made your skin crawl. I held the flashlight, fixing the yellowish beam on my buddy's feet. The fine beads of moisture oozing from the gray-green thick hide began to change color under the flashlight. They grew bigger and bigger, eventually rolling down the curve of the flesh. They dropped into the sticky liquid below, turning the surrounding yellow mud into a patch of green. I pulled the flashlight back a bit, wondering why the radio had suddenly gone silent. Just then, a strange pulling sound came from the mud beside me. It sounded like a dozen thick rubber bands being stretched to their limit, buzzing and snapping in the air. I shifted the flashlight beam down to my feet, right onto the sandbag I was standing on. The burlap texture on that sandbag had long worn off. Now it had flipped over completely. A 2-foot-long split had opened in its middle. On both sides of the split were rings of thick flesh, like old tree bark, and that flesh was turning outward. As it turned, a long, pitch-black rope shot out from inside. It wasn't an ordinary rope. It was covered in dense bumps, with a layer of sticky, stringy slime on its surface. That black, thick rope whipped through the air and snapped tight around my buddy's good right ankle with a loud crack. My buddy was leaning against the dirt wall, groaning. The violent yank pulled him straight off the wall. His body slid 1.5 feet through the mud, and his entire right leg was dragged into that split in the flesh. It's grabbing me. It's digging into my flesh. My buddy frantically clawed at the thick rope around his ankle with his right hand. He dug his thumb in hard, but that black rope was as stiff as a solid steel cable. His fingernails left white scratches on it, but he couldn't budge it even a millimeter. Before I could reach out to help him, the entire dirt wall behind us suddenly shook violently. Huge chunks of yellow mud fell, crashing onto my steel helmet and sending sharp pain through my neck. I shone my flashlight upward and behind me, freezing in place instantly. The dozens of sandbags we had stacked over the foxhole during the day had now burst through their dried mud shells. They hadn't scattered. Instead, countless black ligaments as thick as fingers had grown from within them, densely crisscrossing like a massive spiderweb, tightly binding all the gray-green flesh into several large clumps. These large clumps of flesh were pulling limbs buried deep in the soil outward. I saw a grotesque body with 4 thighs squeezing its way out of the earthen wall inch by inch. Its 4 thighs all faced the same direction, with no pelvic support, held together solely by a mass of gray-green dead flesh in the middle. With each push outward, the 4 legs would fold backward, making heavy, dull thuds in the muddy water. The flashlight beam danced wildly over these large clumps of flesh. I spotted several pairs of eyes of varying sizes peering from the gaps between the flesh. Some were as large as fists, while others were tiny, densely packed on a single patch of skin. All these eyes were moving, blinking rapidly in the heavy rain. With each blink, a thick stream of gray-green mucus oozed out. Just then, the radio crackled to life again. But it wasn't the commander's voice that came through. Instead, there was a rapid, dense sound of flesh slamming against flesh, followed by the desperate gasps and struggles of several people in the mud. Save! Save! All fused together. All fused. Before the sentence could finish, a sharp, crisp snapping sound echoed from the radio like someone breaking a freshly harvested thigh bone in two with their bare hands. Then only a gurgling, bubbling noise remained, as if the entire device had been shoved into a sack filled with viscous fluid. Outside Foxhole 2, the rain grew even more torrential. In the blinding flash of a distant lightning strike, I saw the entire communication trench behind our defensive line. Thousands of bulletproof sandbags, originally stacked along both sides, had now risen from the mud. Under the lightning's glare, their massive gray-green bodies formed an endless mountain of flesh. Some were large, others small, some with 7 or 8 backward-bending limbs, squeezing and writhing against each other in the narrow trench. Their dead flesh fused together on a large scale in the rain. When 2 massive chunks of gray-green flesh, each weighing hundreds of pounds, collided, the bumpy skin between them would split open instantly. Countless black ligaments, like living worms, crawled over, forcibly twisting the 2 separate bodies into an even larger monstrosity. The entire defensive line had completely collapsed at this moment. What was once our protective position had now become part of the living flesh of these creatures. The massive fleshy maw beside me continued to devour. My comrade's entire right leg had already been swallowed into the pile of gray-green sandbags. The heavy chunks of flesh began to close in, like a thick meaty door, tightly locking his leg inside. He clawed at the wild grass in the mud with his right hand, pulling up clumps of grass and soil. His shoes churned up large patches of white foam in the muddy water, but his body continued to sink inch by inch into the fleshy mass covered in eyes. Gray-green lumps were emerging from the earthen walls all around. Blinking their eyes, they pressed their heavy weight into our narrow foxhole. The viscous fluid beneath my feet had already risen to my thighs. Shining the flashlight, I saw nothing but densely packed black ligaments twisting and tightening underwater, ready to wrap around my boots. The black ligaments beneath my feet grabbed the heel of my boot. The force was immense, yanking me forward and sending me sprawling face first into the muddy water, my torso slamming into the muck. My comrade beside me completely lost his mind. With his uninjured right hand, he pulled out the short military knife he used for opening cans. Sobbing hysterically, he began stabbing wildly at his own right leg, which was trapped by the dead flesh. "Let me go. Let me go." He drove his bayonet over and over into the fabric of his trousers, shredding the cloth to pieces. Yet the dead flesh there was clamped too tightly. The blade tip struck it with a harsh, grating sound, like stabbing into a solid, aged truck tire. That layer of strange, gray-green skin only dented inward a few millimeters, not even breaking the surface, and instead trapped the tip of his blade firmly in the crevice of the flesh. His comrade's short knife slipped from his grip, and he began frantically pounding his thigh with his fists, then biting at that strange, bumpy skin with his teeth. In the process of pounding, all his fingernails tore backward, leaving 5 green-tinged fingerprints in the mud. I lifted my head from the muddy water and grabbed the rifle tossed beside me. Pressing the muzzle hard against the black ligament wrapped around my boot, I began pulling the trigger like a madman. Bang! 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 The muzzle flash was only a dozen centimeters from my face, illuminating the viscous fluid on the ground in a deep red. The bullet struck the black ligament at close range. The rigid ligament shuddered violently, its surface dented with deep grooves. But the dead flesh inside immediately squeezed inward, trapping every bullet tightly. The ligament didn't break. Instead, under the physical impact of the bullets, it contracted even tighter. A loud cracking sound came from the heel of my boot. The steel plate in the sole was being deformed by the force. I released the rifle, braced my hands against the ground, and desperately tried to pull my right foot free. My ankle cracked loudly inside the boot, skin and leather grinding violently, the pain bringing tears to my eyes. Gritting my teeth, I yanked my right leg upward with all my strength, forcibly pulling my entire right foot out of the deformed boot, leaving only a thick woolen sock. Before I could steady myself, the stacked sandbag breastworks to my left completely collapsed. 5 massive gray-green lumps of flesh, each weighing hundreds of pounds, slid down from the wall simultaneously. They didn't scatter apart but clung together like enormous lumps of dough. The black ligaments between them stretched taut, emitting a creaking, grating sound. These massive flesh masses folded backward in the muddy water, completely blocking our only exit behind us. Half of my comrade's body was now fully engulfed by that gaping maw of flesh. His abdomen and chest were tightly clamped between 2 thick slabs of gray-green dead flesh, which began to close together like 2 heavy iron doors, slowly pressing his body deeper into the mud. His right hand still flailed blindly in the muck, finally grabbing onto my pant leg. His fingers dug in so hard they tore the pocket of my trousers. Pull! Pull! He began spewing thick green mucus from his mouth, his entire face distorted by the flesh pressing down from above, one eyelid forced completely inside out. I stared at the massive wall of flesh blocking our path. Dozens of round nodules on its surface were blinking on a large scale, and with each blink, the black ligaments inside crushed the surrounding soil into pieces. These hundreds of pounds of dead flesh piled higher and higher, slowly sealing off the only light above us. Continuing to shoot was pointless. Every bullet fired at them was perfectly absorbed by their dense, dead flesh. I reached toward my chest. My tactical vest still held 2 defensive grenades, and a flare gun for distress signals was holstered at my waist. The space here was too confined. If I detonated a grenade directly in the muddy water, the blast wave would be completely absorbed by the surrounding thick flesh, unable to breach this hundreds of pounds wall of meat. Instead, it would shatter my eardrums and knock me unconscious in this mud pit. I had to exploit their physical mechanics. Though immune to bullet penetration and lacking destructible skeletal joints, they relied entirely on those black ligaments and viscous mud to hold together. Their current structure was that of extremely heavy, solid flesh masses. If I treated the gap between two writhing masses of flesh as a solid steel cylinder and wedged a grenade deep inside, the immense gas pressure from the explosion would have no room to expand laterally in the narrow crevice. That physical pressure would act like a piston, forcibly pushing the two massive hunks of dead flesh, each weighing hundreds of pounds in opposite directions. I clenched the flashlight tightly between my teeth. The yellowish beam shook violently on the wall of flesh with each breath. Lying in the sticky green water, I braced against the descending flesh with my left hand, while my right hand found the pull ring of the first grenade on my chest. My comrade's hand finally slipped from my pant leg. His entire arm was already completely covered by the overturned gray-green sandbag beside him. That entire row of flesh chunks was merging together on a large scale in the rain, turning his body into a foundational stone beneath this bulletproof breastwork. I had no time to pull him out. I thrust my left hand into the gap between two large, blinking flesh chunks ahead. The crevice was less than 10 centimeters wide, filled with slippery green mucus. As my hand went in, those two heavy slabs of dead flesh seemed to sense the intrusion and immediately began closing in, tightly clamping my wrist. Clenching the flashlight between my teeth, I yanked the grenade's safety pin with my right hand. The moment the spring clip flew off with a ping, I mustered all my strength and shoved the now smoking grenade deep into the black ligaments connecting the two massive flesh chunks. The two gray-green slabs clamped down too tightly. After I forced the grenade in, the surrounding dead flesh suddenly squeezed inward like a pair of iron doors weighing over 200 pounds. My wrist was caught in between, and my bones let out a sharp crack. The strange, bumpy skin clung tightly to mine, and the black ligaments inside began wriggling like tiny worms into my sleeve. Gritting the flashlight in my teeth, I grabbed my trapped left hand with my right and yanked backward with all my might. Rip! A large patch of skin was scraped raw from the back of my left hand by the rough, strange hide. Green mucus mixed with filthy water bubbled from the wound. The force of the pull sent me tumbling backward into thigh-deep muddy water. The grenade was already emitting white smoke from deep within the flesh crevice. 1, 2, 3. I wrapped my arms tightly over my helmet, threw myself forward, and buried my face completely in the sticky green water below. Boom! An incredibly dull, heavy thud erupted from the flesh wall. It lacked the deafening, sharp blast of a typical explosion. It sounded more like someone had swung a massive 100-pound sledgehammer into a solid slab of dead pork. The explosion's flames were completely smothered within the thick layers of dead flesh. I only saw a dim, murky red glow flicker through the crevice ahead. Then, the immense physical pressure detonated within the narrow gap. The trapped blast, with nowhere else to go, erupted violently in the direction I had shoved the grenade. Two massive gray-green flesh masses, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were forcibly shoved apart by the tremendous physical force in that instant. The black ligaments, as thick as fingers, connecting them snapped one after another under the strain. Each taut ligament broke with a sharp crack, like someone cracking a heavy iron whip right beside my ear. The flesh wall that had completely blocked the exit was now blasted open by the grenade's pressure, leaving a crooked gap over a foot wide. Without even wringing out my clothes, I clawed at the yellow mud with both hands and scrambled through the newly blasted flesh gap. At that moment, the surrounding piles of sandbags, previously motionless, went into a frenzy. The grenade blast had awakened all the flesh chunks along the entire defensive line. The two large flesh masses flanking the gap began violently shaking, their dozens of large eyeballs spinning rapidly in the muddy water, each one fixed intently on me as I crawled. A grotesque limb, twisted together from 4 deformed human legs, swung horizontally toward my back with a whooshing physical force. Half my body had just squeezed into the gap when I heard the movement behind me. I could only lunge forward desperately. Thwack! The bizarre, fleshy pillar slammed into the muddy ground right behind my hips. The sheer physical force of that blow was terrifying. The watery mud and green sludge were sent flying wildly to both sides, leaving a half-meter-deep crater in the ground. Splattered mucus splatted against the back of my bulletproof vest. Though the several hundred-pound impact didn't hit me directly, the resulting mud wave flung me forward, and my thigh slammed hard against the surface of the adjacent grotesque flesh. The flashlight clenched in my teeth was knocked loose by the impact, flying out and landing with a plop in the green water nearby. Only a yellowish beam of light shot diagonally from beneath the surface, casting an eerie green glow on the writhing flesh chunks around me. I had no time to retrieve the flashlight. My bare right foot, clad in a thick cotton sock, dug desperately into the sticky, muddy water. Using my elbows and knees alternately, I squirmed like a loach through this foot-wide crevice of flesh, straining to push my way out. Just as I was halfway through, the fleshy wall above me began to collapse. The sandbags that had been stacked in layers overhead now stretched their black ligaments to the limit. 2 massive gray-green slabs of meat, each weighing 400 to 500 pounds, began to close in, ready to seal this blasted gap shut once more. My shoulders were tightly clamped between the 2 slabs of flesh. The skin above was rough, covered in hard bumps of varying sizes, pressing firmly against both sides of my bulletproof vest. The physical pressure grew increasingly intense, squeezing the vest shell until it emitted a creaking, plastic-deforming sound. My chest was compressed so tightly I couldn't even exhale, and my ears were filled with the bubbling sound of mud forced out by the pressure. I felt my 2 collarbones aching under the weight of these hundreds of pounds of meat. If they moved just 1 more centimeter inward, my ribcage would be crushed on the spot. With my right hand, I gripped the second grenade hanging from my chest. My left hand, already covered in slime and wounds from the earlier explosion and struggle, couldn't even hold the grenade's safety pin. I lowered my head, clamped the steel ring of the grenade's pull ring between my front teeth, and yanked my neck back with all my strength. Bang! The pull ring was torn off with my teeth. A bloody mark was left on my lips from the steel ring, and my mouth filled with the taste of rust and foul water. I didn't throw this grenade forward. I knew it wouldn't blast open the closing wall of flesh. Instead, I shoved the grenade, its safety lever already released, deep into the gap between my thigh and the gray-green monstrous flesh beside me, tucking it tightly into the seam of my bulletproof jacket. 1, 2. I crossed my arms over my neck and head, curling my body into a tight ball like a shrimp, and squeezed my eyes shut. Boom! A second muffled physical explosion erupted beside my thigh. This blast was too close, though most of the terrifying physical pressure was absorbed by the gray-green dead flesh around me. The remaining shockwave struck my right thigh and buttock like a sledgehammer. The hem of my bulletproof jacket was instantly shredded into countless strips. Chunks of shattered gray-green flesh and mud, mixed with scalding physical bubbles, rained down on my helmet and back. But it was precisely this confined physical pressure that forced the 400-pound slab of meat pressing against my right side to shift over a foot to the right. The dozens of thick ligaments connecting this massive flesh to the earthen wall above were torn apart in an instant by the blast wave. The entire earthen wall and bulletproof parapet above lost their support at that moment, and large chunks of clay and dozens of living sandbags began to rain down on me. Seizing the momentary gap opened beside my thigh, I frantically clawed at the mud with both hands, belly to the ground, and scrambled forward 3 or 4 meters through the collapsing crevice of flesh. Rumble! Just 1 second after I surged forward, the narrow No. 2 foxhole behind me completely collapsed. Dozens of gray-green massive bodies and tons of yellow mud and water crashed heavily onto the spot I had just crawled through. The piled flesh compacted the bottom of the foxhole, filling every bit of space with dead meat. The mudslide from the collapse hurled me forward, sending me tumbling twice through the muck of the communication trench. At that moment, another blinding white lightning bolt streaked across the horizon. In that 1 or 2 seconds of intense light, I lifted my head from the mud and looked out over the entire front line. The bulletproof sandbags that had once lined the kilometers-long trenches were no longer in their original positions. In the heavy rain, they had merged into massive mountains of flesh. I saw a supersized entity, fused from hundreds of sandbags, slowly crawling from the direction of the main position. Its gray-green body, over 10 meters long, was covered in hundreds of strange, nail-less physical limbs that continuously folded backward and clawed at the mud, plowing deep trenches several meters wide into the ground. Wherever it passed, the wooden ammunition crates, barbed wire, and heavy machine guns lying in the mud that the U.S. military had issued were all swallowed whole by the thick, lifeless flesh beneath its body. The barbs of the barbed wire pierced its grotesque skin, but couldn't even scratch the surface. Instead, they were clamped tightly by its writhing muscles and became part of its outer layer. The gunfire from the main defensive position had completely ceased. The entire front line was now filled only with the heavy, splattering sound of torrential rain, pounding on countless mounds of gray-green, lifeless flesh. Under the flashes of lightning, those mountains of flesh blinked their thousands of eyes with excruciating slowness. With each blink, tons of gray-green mucus would flow down their bodies and into the trenches. I had no rifle anymore. It was buried somewhere deep beneath the flesh pits. My right foot was bare, and the back of my left hand was covered in oozing fluid from scraped-off skin. My right thigh had been rendered useless by the physical pressure of a grenade blast, leaving me to push forward through knee-deep green water with my only intact left leg. Behind me, the collapsed sandbag piles in the mud began to emit squelching, crushing sounds once again. The hundreds of pounds of lifeless flesh were readjusting their positions in the muddy water. A thick black ligament covered in nodules had already emerged from beneath the sludge, swaying left and right like a venomous snake in the downpour. Its sensory hairs were searching through the mud for my other boot. Gritting my teeth, I dug my hands into the wet soil of the second communication trench ahead, desperately dragging myself forward. Clawing at the wet soil of the second communication trench, I finally managed to pull myself completely out of the mud of the second foxhole. Behind me, the black ligament slapped the water's surface, splashing up a spray of green water. Failing to hook onto my foot, it sank back beneath the surface. The rain continued to hammer against my helmet. I collapsed into a puddle in the second communication trench, my back pressed tightly against a dirt wall studded with rubble. I gasped for breath, the rainwater streaming down my face, washing away some of the green mucus. I looked down at my own body. The pants on my right thigh had been shredded into tattered strips by the pressure of the second grenade. The skin of my entire thigh was covered in dense, dark purple bruises, physical wounds, inflicted by the grenade's blast through my clothing. A large patch of skin was missing from the back of my left hand, revealing raw, red flesh still clinging with strands of stubborn gray-green mucus. My bare right foot was caked in yellow mud, and half of my big toenail had been torn off by a rock while crawling, now oozing blood. Leaning against the wall, I struggled to stand on my intact left leg. Hobbling along the second communication trench, I made my way toward the company headquarters tent in the rear. Along the way, there wasn't a single living soul in the entire trench. The muddy water was littered with flattened aluminum canteens, broken wooden rifle stocks, and a few steel buttons torn from bulletproof vests. At a corner, I spotted a crushed radio lying askew in the mud. The steel casing of the machine had been crumpled into a twisted lump by some immense force, its red and green copper wires mashed into a tangled mess. Beside the mangled metal, a deformed military boot heel lay trampled in the mud. I dragged myself another dozen meters along the communication trench before stopping to glance back at the second foxhole I had just escaped from. A faint flash of lightning flickered through the distant clouds. In that final glimmer of light, I saw that the dozens of gray-green flesh mounds that had collapsed along the defensive line in front of the second foxhole had all sunk back into the mud. They had neatly stacked themselves together again, 3 layers high, 5 layers wide. Their nodule-covered skin had tightened once more, and the hundreds of eyes that dotted their surfaces were now all closed, reverting to a motionless, deathly gray-green. From a distance, their orderly shape looked exactly like the bulletproof sandbags we had stacked with our own hands during the day. The rain continued to pour, and the rising floodwaters slowly buried the grotesque skin at the bottom of the mounds back into the yellow mud.